World leaders meet for this year's UN General Assembly. The most powerful people gather to take on the planet's most perilous problems. But can they work together to bring about meaningful change? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the United Nations General Assembly. Last year, they met virtually, but this year, New York's at a virtual standstill as most of the world's top diplomats come face to face. For 3/4 of a century, the UN has pledged to try to make the world a safer and better place. And before we discuss whether they've achieved that, let's take a closer look at the body itself. The United Nations was established in 1945 after the Second World War by 51 countries. Today, that membership number stands at 193. The UN provides food and assistance to about 91 million people across 83 countries. It also provides life-saving vaccines to 45% of children around the world. And in 2001, the United Nations and then Secretary General Kofi Annan were awarded the Nobel Prize for their work in creating a more peaceful planet. Well, undoubtedly, the United Nations has had noteworthy successes, but it's also had its fair share of failures. In 1994, at least 800,000, mostly ethnic Tutsis, were massacred by Hutu extremists. It was one of the worst genocides in modern history, and the UN admitted it was ashamed of its failure to prevent it. And then there's the war in Syria. Hundreds of thousands have been killed during the conflict, and as far back as 2013, then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon acknowledged the UN was responsible for a collective failure after being unable to prevent atrocities. But what about the United Nations today? Well, this year's General Assembly will be the first since a rather divisive U.S. president left office. Now, while Donald Trump was in power, his speeches at the UN were always highly anticipated. Sometimes they even got a few laughs, albeit unintentionally.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Now, Donald Trump was never afraid of reiterating his America First policy, but that message alienated many of his allies at the UN. So when Joe Biden became president, there was renewed hope that the U.S. could better re-engage with the world, with more global cooperation and less of Trump's nationalist isolationism. But has that really happened? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined now by Richard Falk, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. He's also written his memoir, Public Intellectual: The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim. Alynna Lyon is a political science professor at the University of New Hampshire and the co-author of the book, The United Nations 75 Years of Promoting Peace, Human Rights, and Development. And George Samuely is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author of Bombs for Peace. Thanks all so much for being with us. George, let me start with you. A number of world leaders, not least, those in Europe, did breathe a sigh of relief when Joe Biden was elected. They remember, many of them, how, the Obama administration that he served under just transformed how the United States interacted with the UN after the Bush administration, especially with John Bolton, dealt out nothing but criticism for the entire organization. So how are you feeling about U.S. participation today, and what are you expecting from America now under Joe Biden?
Well, the United States, as always, is pursuing its own national interest. It is as unilateralist as the Trump administration. We've just seen evidence of this in the past few weeks when the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan without bothering to consult its closest allies, its partners in the whole Afghanistan venture. It didn't bother to consult any of Afghanistan's neighboring states who were going to feel the repercussions from migration, terrorism, heroin trade, and everyone else. No one was consulted by the United States. And then we saw just a few days ago the United States actually basically telling its closest historic ally, France, to go and shove it. When it signed this agreement to build nuclear powered submarines for Australia. Now the Europeans are very, very upset and saying we have been betrayed, stab in the back, treachery, and so on. But they should have known better, and it was very naive of people to think that somehow the United States would become this global universalist benign uncle. No, the United States does today what it has always done, which is to pursue its own national interest. And if somebody gets in the way, tough luck.
Okay. Alynna, I mean, was it naive to think that Biden might be better than Trump, or is it just as unilateralist as George was putting it there, as Trump was, only arguably less vocal about it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, except that, there's a couple differences with Biden than with Trump. First of all, Biden has a lot of U.S. foreign policy experience. He's been in the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was vice president for a long time. And the other key point is that he actually speaks as though he cares about multilateralism. And so, I agree with George that, in the last 6 weeks, there's quite a shadow on U.S. capacity to engage with its partners, to cooperate with other countries. And there's been a couple of moments, particularly with the French and then with Afghanistan, where allies are very upset. And so there has been this distance. At the same time, the Trump administration significantly kind of battered and bruised and snubbed and shut down all those particular venues. And this is a different moment. One, Biden and the administration is open to those types of relationships. Two, they also know this isn't 10 years ago, this isn't 20 years ago. They know that in order for their agenda, whether or not that's climate change or COVID mitigation, they need the international community around them to be able to do that work.
Okay. Robert Falk, go ahead.
Well, I shared most of the views that were articulated by your other guests. I would say that the Biden claim to multilateralism has been validated to some extent by his commitment to rejoin the climate agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, and at least a nominal effort to reanimate the Iran nuclear agreement. This shows a kind of different approach than the transactionalism of Trump and his blatant repudiation of a multilateral global solidarity approach to global problem solving. And I think that does translate into important differences, but I certainly agree that the primacy of geopolitics leads, especially the P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, to use the UN as a tool of foreign policy. That is, it's fine if it promotes the national interest as perceived by the leaders, and it's objectionable if it blocks the pursuit of national interest.
Right. Robert, it's interesting that you noted climate first, because arguably more important than the usual conflict resolution issues is actually addressing the UN scientists' warning that the world is on this catastrophic pathway, as they actually put it, because of a global failure to deal with climate change. So, George, let me ask you this. I mean, is everyone on the same page now? Is Secretary General Guterres, when he says the war on our planet must end, we need to put climate change really as the ultimate priority for the United Nations and for the world?
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, we've still got the basic problem with climate change is this, that the Western powers, and that now will include the United States, talk about reducing fossil fuel emissions and going down to zero emissions, whereas many of the world's countries, the economically developing countries, see fossil fuels as the mechanism for economic progress. And so they naturally point to the hypocrisy of Western powers demanding massive reductions in fossil fuels when it was precisely the cheap, ready availability of fossil fuels that facilitated the development of the Western powers. So they point to the hypocrisy. They say, why should we basically tie our hands behind our back and stop becoming great economic powers just because now you've got all this alternative technology and you can afford to give up on fossil fuels. So we'll see whether this works out. And but I think there's really going to be the problem because India and China, not unreasonably, say, well, why should we have to give up our fossil fuel emissions?
Right. But Alynna, I mean, most agree that climate change is a global emergency now. So regardless of the past and the fact that developed countries did get to exploit to a great extent the use of fossil fuels to build their economies and their industries, we are where we are now. And the United States is still the single biggest contributor to the United Nations. It's arguably with China, is the world power now, one of the most influential still. So Joe Biden wants climate change to be an issue. Do you think, even though he's been weakened arguably over the last 6 weeks, as you noted, do you think he can come on stage now and actually help take the lead on this pressing, very important issue?
I think that's really an interesting question, in part because, I mean, it's whether or not the Biden administration has the commitment, and then do they have the capacity? One of the examples that I look to, for example, is the Obama administration. So in the lead up to the Paris climate change agreements, and of course, we're looking now at Glasgow in November. So, the Biden administration and the international community are looking at this big climate summit, COP26 in November, and they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get countries to agree? And George points out there's a lot of tensions, developing countries, mid countries, depending on what you use for your resources, for energy resources, there's a lot of different diversity there. Excuse me, but in 2016, for 18 months prior to that particular conference, the Obama administration and the Chinese actually worked aggressively to help countries figure out what their carbon emissions are. They helped with a lot of technical support. There was a lot of work that was done preliminary. So the Biden administration actually doesn't have that luxury because they weren't in office 18 months ago. But there is a lot of work that can be done just over the next couple of months in quietly getting countries to the table, figuring out where there is potential for compromise and what their priorities are. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work that can be done that could be very effective for Glasgow in November.
Robert, then I'll let you expand on what you alluded to initially and whether you think the United States can actually provide the kind of guidance and have the reputation of being a leader, at least at some better points, to take the lead on global climate change and see if the UN can actually truly be effective on this issue.
As was suggested by George, the record of the United States will depend on whether it's forthcoming in concrete terms and makes a sacrifice in its own program of reducing emissions that takes account of this inequity or mismatch between the experiences of the developing countries and the developed countries. The United States' leadership will depend on concrete policy commitments that show a sense of equity plus solidarity in meeting an emergency crisis. And unless it's done, I think the whole effort will falter and the world will move closer and closer to a catastrophic reckoning with the consequences of not addressing climate change.
It is frightening. And also frightening right now is how this planet is dealing with the pandemic, which will obviously be a major topic to be tackled at the UNGA this year. George, if we look at issues like vaccine inequality, are we going to see a greater union between members of the United Nations, or will those discussions actually highlight greater divides, especially between wealthier countries and poorer countries, whereby wealthier countries are arguably hoarding vaccines while poorer countries are not getting their populations vaccinated as was desired?
No, I think that's right. I think, but that's in a way kind of an inevitability of great power politics and nation states. I mean, obviously, the great powers look after themselves first. As we're finding, the United States is in a position where it's almost involved in a massive effort of its own to get its unvaccinated population, who knows, 80 million, 100 million, getting them vaccinated. So that's the United States' priority right now. So, it really isn't a huge priority for the United States to start pushing the vaccines onto the rest of the world. And so I don't think much progress is to be expected. There's also the other aspect of it, which is, and there is a kind of a global interest in finding out about the origin of the virus. I mean, how did it come about? And there again, I think, we're not really making too much progress because, China, and this is a point that has been made by the World Health Organization, is doing very little to cooperate. And so there's clearly a global interest to prevent another pandemic in the next 5, 10, 15 years. But we don't know the origin of this virus. It's going to be hard to stop the next one.
Okay. I mean, Alynna, if George is right, especially if he's right in this case, how divisive do you think the handling of the pandemic and then this discussion going forward of vaccine inequality, I mean, how divisive could it prove, especially at this meeting?
Well, I actually think that there's been quite a bit of progress. So last year, if you take it back to a year in September, the Trump administration sent in a very short video. The video was really kind of pointing fingers and blaming the Chinese. We've moved beyond that. The Biden administration actually has a side virtual meeting trying to work on rallying the international community to make commitments. And there's some specific, but I'll say very ambitious targets about getting the world 70% vaccinated in 12 months. And so, I mean, there's at least the priority is there. The other thing is, this is one of those places where leadership, whether it's from the United States or from any other country, is really essential. And there is possibility for what one would call robust multilateralism. Countries have their populations dying at extraordinary rates. So this is a threat to human security. This is a threat to national security. There are economic challenges. Here in the United States, we have all sorts of issues in terms of inflation and unemployment. And, there are lots of layers to this. And then it's also a threat to international security, right? COVID-19 is something that transcends borders. It makes countries insecure, and it actually inhibits diplomacy. I mean, if you're just seeing that we have such reduced numbers of people at the UN this week in terms of doing diplomacy, it's very difficult to do the work of global governance or try to promote your own agenda if people are, on Zoom or not actually in the room.
Right. I mean, Robert, do you think this assembly, do you expect it to, reach any sort of more protective, humanistic consensus regarding the pandemic and, vaccine equality in particular, especially when we're looking at leaders like Jair Bolsonaro flaunting the fact that, he doesn't need a vaccine and that it's wrong for the United States to demand that leaders come vaccinated if they want to participate in person?
Well, as has been suggested, we're living in a state-centric world. And an issue of this kind does lead national leaders to be preoccupied and give priority to how they handle the domestic scene. So the international solidarity aspects, which are nurtured to some extent by the rhetoric of statecraft, come in a very subordinate secondary way. So I would say, to answer your question, that it's very unlikely that there will be a change in the basic atmospherics of national cooperation as a result of this General Assembly session, particularly if they focus on the COVID crisis, because that does bring out these very fundamental fissures in international relations.
Right.
Where the UN is strong is when they deal with soft power issues that have a broad consensus and don't generate intense conflict between important national interests.
Right. Give us some of your favorite examples of those soft power kind of successes.
Well, in the context of COVID, when the WHO, for instance, disseminated information to the developing world and pronounced that this disease should be treated as a pandemic, that was globally effective and important in mobilizing the kind of energy needed to address a health crisis of this magnitude.
Right.
And the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa is another example where racism was something that countries could subscribe to, even though they had differing national
Interesting, though, they still had to battle with the U.S. under Ronald Reagan to try and get, anti-apartheid legislation passed internationally and with the U.S., with Ronald Reagan actually vetoing anti-apartheid legislation. But eventually it did come together. And that was one of the better successes. But let me turn back to George, because as Robert was saying, it's about this state-centric approach that is a lot of what the UN does, even though it's supposed to be doing the opposite. And that is why many say it's not an effective enough body. So we're having this discussion, we've had it before. I mean, how can the United Nations become more relevant then if it has these sorts of divides? When will the UN actually be able to adapt to changing times, or is it actually destined to maintain that same structure it was erected with, in 1945 that so many people feel is entirely outdated?
Well, I think the United Nations General Assembly does do a lot of very useful work. I think it articulates a body of international law. So, yes, the General Assembly resolutions don't have the binding force of law, but nonetheless, they are an important expression of the will of the international community. And so, for instance, when we have some issue like economic sanctions, the United Nations General Assembly has passed many, many resolutions making clear that the use of economic coercion by powers, especially great powers, against smaller powers is prohibited. Now, of course, that continues to this day, continues very much under the Biden administration and in the European Union, just as much as it was under the Trump administration. The United States and the great powers use sanctions all the time against smaller, weaker countries. Yeah. But the fact is that the General Assembly has made this a very important statement. They made very important statements also about what is friendly relations between states. What are hostile relations between states? What is war? It defines what an aggressive war is. So the United States likes to get around and say, well, no one really knows what exactly aggressive war is, so let's leave that aside. We could just have international law without establishing what aggressive war is. But the United Nations General Assembly has done that. It's articulated. And as Richard pointed out about apartheid, that was an important expression of the will of the international community. So it does that. But in terms of great power politics, of course, it can't affect that too much.
Alynna, last minute and a half, and let me finish with you then, and tell us what you're really hoping. As someone who tends to be slightly more optimistic about what the UN can really achieve, tell us what you're hoping to see out of this General Assembly when it finishes.
Well, I think we sit at a very precarious moment in history. this is the moment that the UN was actually created for in 1945, right? To prevent violence, to deal with some of the issues of human security. You remember in 45, there was a huge refugee crisis. They had come out of the Spanish flu, also a global pandemic. And so I think that really, hopefully, being optimistic is looking for revitalization of multilateralism. And I think that the expectation that everybody is going to kind of drop their national interest and just kind of come together is really is not realistic. At the same time, it is okay to, in these pockets, soft power or little pieces here and there, to expect that just the fact that the delegates are back in the room, they can have conversations, means hopefully that some of the work of trying to create a more peaceful, a more equitable, a more just world is actually being done in New York this week.
Okay. Alynna, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists so very much for joining us, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.